The text message came in at 11:22 on a Friday night while I was sitting in a rental car outside a Marriott in Columbus, Ohio, eating a gas station sandwich and reviewing a client's payroll discrepancy report. My brother sent it. 3 words, "We're all good." I didn't understand it at first. Then I checked a joint savings account I'd made the mistake of giving him view access to 18 months earlier, the one that had held $340,000 that morning, and I understood it completely. My name is Serena. I'm 32 years old. I've worked in forensic accounting for 8 years, which means corporations and insurance carriers pay me to find the money that isn't where it's supposed to be. I am, by the nature of what I do every day, a person who reads numbers the way other people read faces. I notice when things don't add up. I notice when my brother started making them not add up, and I spent 7 months making sure that when he finally moved, I was already 3 moves ahead. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My brother Caden is 5 years older than me. Growing up, he was the one my parents bragged about at dinner parties. Football captain, full ride to a state school. The kind of easy confidence that made adults trust him before he'd done anything to earn it. I was the one who stayed in on weekends to study. I was the one who graduated with honors from a program most people at our high school had never heard of and went directly into an internship that turned into a career. My parents loved me. They also never quite understood me the way they understood him, and I made peace with that a long time ago. Caden's adult life had been a series of promising starts that didn't finish. A sales management job he left after 8 months, a real estate venture in Phoenix that dissolved in a lawsuit, a contracting business he ran with his college roommate that was doing fine until it suddenly wasn't. His wife, Pam, had her own pattern. She worked in bursts, quit when things got stressful, picked up something new. Between the two of them, they cycled through money, the way other people cycle through moods. By the time my dad had his first stroke 4 years ago, Caden and Pam were living in a rental in Tucson, behind on 2 credit cards, and neither of them was in a position to help with anything. I flew home to Charlotte. I handled the hospital paperwork. I coordinated with the neurologist. I talked to my parents' financial planner about what the next few years might look like. My mom was 67 and had never managed their finances independently. My dad had always handled it, and the stroke had left him verbal but significantly impaired when it came to complex decisions. She needed support. She asked me if she and my dad could move to Austin, where I'd bought a small house 2 years earlier on a quiet street near the university. She said just temporarily. She said 6 months, maybe 8, until they figured out their footing. I said yes because I loved them and because my dad's neurologist had been clear that stability and consistency were critical to his recovery. I set up the guest suite. I bought a hospital-grade bed frame. I scheduled the home health aide visits around my own work travel. I did all of this without being asked twice because that's who I am, and I knew it, and I thought the people around me knew it too. Caden came to help with the move. That part was fine. He stayed 4 days, helped load the truck, got my dad settled, cried a little in the driveway in the way that costs nothing but looks like everything. Then he went back to Tucson. The call started about 3 months after my parents moved in. Not to me, to my mom. Long conversations, an hour sometimes, about how things were tight right now, how Pam's hours had been cut, how there was a deal that just needed a little bridge funding to come together. My mom told me about these calls in the way she always delivered information she knew I'd react to, carefully, sideways, in the middle of telling me something else. She mentioned once that she'd given him $600. Then she mentioned it again, different amount, different month. I asked her how many times. She looked at the window. I want to be precise here, because precision is how I process things that make me want to put my fist through a wall. Over the next 5 months, my mother gave my brother approximately $14,000 from the joint account she shared with my dad, the account I had been replenishing every month to cover their household expenses and medical costs. She gave it to him in amounts small enough that none of them individually triggered a conversation. She gave it to him because he was her son and he asked, and she didn't know how to say no to him, and she genuinely believed he would pay it back. He did not pay it back. I didn't find out about the full amount until I reconciled the account in September during a quarterly review I did on all of my financial accounts. I sat at my kitchen table at 6 in the morning with a spreadsheet open and traced every outgoing transfer for the previous 6 months. It took me 40 minutes. When I was done, I had a complete picture. I did not wake my mother up. I closed the laptop, made coffee, and sat with it for an hour. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Denise, and she's been my attorney for 4 years. She does estate planning and civil litigation, and she has a quality I need in the people I work with, which is that she never tells me what I want to hear when what I want to hear isn't accurate. I walked her through the numbers. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "How much access does your brother have to your accounts, not your parents, yours?" I told her about the joint savings. I had added him as a view-only user 18 months earlier because I'd been traveling heavily for a 6-month contract, and I wanted someone local who could tell me if something looked wrong with my parents' expenses. View only, not transfer authority. She said, "Make sure it stays that way and don't change it yet." That was the beginning. What I did over the following 7 months was not a trap. I want to be clear about that, because Caden's attorney later called it entrapment, which is a word that has a specific legal definition that absolutely did not apply, and Denise found that framing so frivolous she nearly laughed out loud in a conference call. What I did was notice a threat developing and protect myself and my parents from it systematically. I am a forensic accountant. Systematic is my native language. The first thing I did was restructure the accounts. My parents' household expense account was quietly migrated to a new institution. The joint savings account Caden had view access to remained open but was reduced to a balance that represented roughly 11% of what he believed was in it. The rest was moved to an account he had no knowledge of. I documented this migration with time-stamped records. I didn't tell my parents the details because my mother, I had learned, was not able to hold information my brother couldn't eventually access. I hired a private investigator named Stuart Calvert, a former Austin PD detective who now ran a small firm doing civil and financial investigations. I'd worked with firms like his before in professional contexts. I explained the situation. He reviewed the financial records I provided and confirmed what I already knew. The transfers from my parents' account showed a pattern consistent with elder financial exploitation under Texas statute. He put that in writing. The second thing I was watching was my own savings account, the one with the large balance that Caden could see but not touch. I noticed him asking questions that told me he was thinking about it. Not direct questions. Caden was never direct. He asked my mom once, in a conversation she relayed to me without realizing what she was relaying, whether I had a financial advisor or if I just kept everything liquid. He asked her whether I used the same bank for everything or split it up. He texted me once asking whether I'd ever looked into a particular investment platform, completely out of nowhere, the kind of casual question that doesn't come from nowhere. I noted all of it. I kept a running document, dated with direct quotes when I had them. In early November, Caden called me directly. He said he had a friend, a guy he'd known since college, who was involved in a private equity opportunity, small buy-in, exceptional returns, but it had to move fast. He said he knew I was conservative with money, but this one was different. He said he could put me in touch. He used the phrase once in a lifetime without irony. I said I'd think about it. I said, "Send me whatever documentation you have." He sent me a 2-page PDF that a competent 5th grader could have identified as fraudulent. I sent it to Denise and to Stuart. Stuart had seen that exact template before. He made some calls. The structure I had built by this point was as follows. The visible account contained a balance that looked significant, but was structured with a series of internal flags, not mechanisms that existed by default, but arrangements I had made specifically with the bank's fraud liaison unit. A relationship Denise had established on my behalf 6 months prior. Any transfer attempt from that account originating from an unauthorized party would route to a review queue, freeze automatically, and generate a federal documentation event, wire fraud across state lines. The paper trail on every dollar. I had also quietly moved every important document in the house, financial records, estate paperwork, my parents' insurance documents, everything, to a fireproof safe in my office closet with a biometric lock. I took an inventory of the house's contents, photographed everything of value. My mother had several pieces of her mother's jewelry that she didn't wear but kept in a box in her dresser. I photographed those. I moved them to the safe. I told my mom they were being cleaned. The trip to Columbus was scheduled in early February, a 3-week engagement with a healthcare distribution company that needed a full accounts payable audit. I had told my family about it a week in advance. I told Caden because he asked my mom when I'd be away next, and she told me he'd asked. I noticed that too. I left on a Monday. By Friday night, sitting in that car with that sandwich, the account had been touched. What Caden had done was move quickly once he thought I was occupied. He had apparently convinced Pam that the timing was right, that I would be too far away and too professional to make a scene. He had accessed a wire transfer service using account information he had assembled over time from the view access he still had to the visible account, from documents he had likely photographed at some earlier point in my parents' house, from the months of careful observation he thought I hadn't noticed. The transfer had routed into the review queue in 11 seconds. The fraud unit flagged it automatically. Adrian, the specialist Denise had connected me with at the bank, had called my cell at 11,018. I'd been on a client call and missed it. I saw his voicemail, then Caden's text, in the same 2-minute window sitting in that parking lot. I called Adrian back first. He confirmed what I already knew. The transfer was frozen, the paper trail was complete, and federal statutes had been triggered by the attempted wire fraud across state lines. He gave me a case reference number. I wrote it on the back of a gas station receipt and took a photograph of it. Then I called Denise. She was calm in a way that I found genuinely steadying. She said, "It's already moving." She said she'd file with the FBI field office in the morning and coordinate with the Austin Financial Crimes Unit. She said, "Go do your job. Let me do mine." I said okay. I went inside and slept for 6 hours, which surprised me, but the thing about preparation is that it removes the part that keeps you awake. There was nothing left to fear because there was nothing left to chance. Caden called me the next morning at 8. I let it ring. He called again at 8:15. I let that one ring too. He sent a text that said, "Serena, call me. There's been some kind of banking error, a banking error." I saved that text with a timestamp. I called him back at 10 after I'd had coffee and reviewed my notes and made sure I was ready to be fully present for the conversation. He answered on the first ring. His voice was doing a thing it did when he was nervous. Higher than normal, slightly clipped, the energy of someone who has already run 3 versions of the conversation in their head and isn't sure which one he's in. He said the transfer didn't go through. He said there was obviously some kind of mistake. He said he was sure it was a system issue. I said, "What transfer?" He was quiet for a beat. He said, "Don't play games with me, Serena." I said, "Caden, I'm at a client engagement in Columbus, Ohio. What are you talking about?" There was a long pause. I let it sit there. He said it was just a loan. I was going to pay it back. I said you were going to take out a loan from an account you don't have transfer authority on, using information you obtained through access I gave you for a specific and different purpose, without asking me? He said I was twisting things. I said, "I'm an accountant. Twisting numbers is actually the thing I get paid to find." He hung up. Pam called me 40 minutes later. Her approach was softer. She said she understood this looked bad. She said Caden had made a mistake. She said they were under so much pressure and he panicked. She said, "Could we please just handle this as a family?" She said going to the police would destroy him. I said I hadn't called the police, which was technically true. My attorney had handled that. What followed was, as these things always are, less cinematic than the conversation. Legal processes are documentation and scheduling and conference calls with exhibit numbers. Stewart's investigation report and the bank's fraud documentation together constituted a case that Denise described as unusually clean. A detective named Hendricks at the Austin Financial Crimes Unit reviewed everything in a single session and told me, in the flat way that career investigators deliver information, that I had done more of their pre-work than they typically see from civilians. I said it's what I do for a living. The federal wire fraud referral moved faster than the state case. Cadden's attorney, a man he found through Pam's cousin, which told me something, negotiated aggressively for a plea that would minimize the federal exposure. What they got was a deferred prosecution agreement, meaning no conviction if he met specific conditions, full restitution of the attempted transfer amount, structured repayment of the $14,000 my parents had given him over the prior year, 2 years of financial monitoring, and mandatory counseling. If he violated any term, the deferred prosecution converted to active charges automatically. I also received, as part of the civil agreement, a formal documented acknowledgement that the transfer attempt had been unauthorized and that he had no legal claim to any portion of my or my parents' finances. Denise had insisted on that language specifically. She said it closes a door that some people try to reopen later. I appreciated her foresight. I flew back to Austin 3 weeks after the Columbus trip ended. My mom knew by then that something serious had happened. I had told her the outline because she deserved to know, and because her testimony about the previous transfers had been part of Stewart's documentation. She cried. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't know. I believed her on the last part. I held her hand for a long time in the kitchen without saying anything, because some things don't need language. She asked me if I would ever forgive him. I said I didn't know. I said forgiveness and trust were different things and I'd figured out how to separate them. She thought about that. My dad, in the slow, particular way of someone rebuilding language after a stroke, asked me one afternoon when I was sitting with him in the backyard whether Caden was okay. I said he was alive and had his health and was going to be okay. My dad nodded for a while. Then he said, "You always handled things." It was the most he'd said to me in one direction in months. I didn't say anything back. I just sat with him and let the afternoon go by. What I did with the back bedroom, the one Caden had used on his visits, was converted into a home office for my parents. A comfortable space with a good chair and a small TV and my dad's record collection organized on 2 new shelves along the wall. My mom uses it every afternoon. My dad goes in there sometimes and puts on an album and sits in the chair and doesn't really do anything, which is, according to his therapist, exactly what he should be doing. The attempted transfer amount was fully restored within 90 days. The elder financial exploitation repayment was structured over 24 months with a monitored account. I don't hold my breath on that timeline, but I have Denise, and I have documentation, and I have a deferred prosecution agreement that converts to federal charges if he misses a payment. I want to say one thing clearly because I've had people ask me whether I felt guilty setting up a situation that would catch him. I didn't set up a situation. I noticed a pattern forming over months. I documented it. I moved my assets to a secure location, and I made sure that if someone attempted to steal from me, there would be a complete and provable record of that attempt. That is not a trap. A trap is when you create conditions that cause someone to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. What I created were conditions that made it impossible for him to succeed at something he was already planning. Those are different things. Caden knew the money wasn't his. He knew my parents' account wasn't his. He chose to move anyway because he had spent his entire adult life betting that consequence would not arrive, and it had mostly worked. He operated on the assumption that I would be too busy or too loyal or too conflict-averse to respond the way I did. He had not paid attention to what I do for a living. People who take from family rely on one calculation above everything else, that the person they're taking from values the relationship more than they value the boundary. They count on you being too sad to be organized, too guilty to file a report, too worried about being called cold to protect what's yours. They call documentation cruelty. They call evidence a betrayal. They call the act of protecting yourself a sign that you never really loved them. I'd watched Caden run that calculation on my parents for years. I'd watched it almost work. So if someone in your life is making you feel that enforcing your own boundaries is a form of disloyalty to them, I'd like you to sit with that for a minute. Loyalty is not the same as availability. Love is not the same as access. And being the person who handles things does not mean you are obligated to handle being taken from. I figured that out at 32. I'm not going back to figuring it out again. I think about the moment I sat at my kitchen table at 6 in the morning, coffee going cold beside me, spreadsheet open, tracing $14,000 that had quietly walked out of my parents' account over 5 months. Nobody had taken it in one dramatic move. It had left in small, careful amounts, the kind of amounts designed to stay under the threshold of a conversation. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the betrayal itself, but the patience of it. The calculation. The belief that I wouldn't look closely enough to see it. The thing about cause and effect is that it doesn't require anyone to announce it. Caden made choices, small ones first, then larger ones, and each choice made the next one easier. That's how it usually works. You give yourself permission to take a little, and then a little becomes a lot, and somewhere in that progression you stop seeing it as taking at all. You start calling it borrowing. You start calling it family. You start telling yourself the person you're taking from has more than enough, as if that changes what the action is. What stopped him wasn't luck. It wasn't timing. It was the fact that I had paid attention, documented what I saw, and built a structure that made the consequence of his choices unavoidable. That's not cruelty. That's just what happens when someone who has spent years assuming there will be no reckoning finally runs into one. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes to protect yourself from someone you love. It requires something that doesn't come naturally to most people, the ability to hold two things at the same time. You can love someone and still refuse to let them harm you. You can grieve a relationship and still enforce a boundary. You can want good things for a person and still make sure they face the consequences of what they chose to do. Those things are not contradictions. They feel like contradictions, especially when the person doing the harm is someone you grew up with, someone who sat at the same table, someone whose voice you've known your whole life, but they're not. What I learned, or maybe what I finally let myself act on, is that doing right by people includes doing right by yourself. It includes being honest about what you're seeing, even when what you're seeing is uncomfortable. It includes using the skills you have, whatever they are, to protect what belongs to you and to the people who depend on you. My dad didn't have the capacity to protect himself anymore. My mom didn't have the tools. I had both. Using them wasn't a choice between loyalty and self-interest. It was the only ethical option I had. And the persistence it took. 7 months of quiet work, of documentation, of moving pieces without showing my hand that didn't come from anger. It came from clarity. Anger is loud and exhausting, and it burns out. Clarity just stays there. It shows you exactly what needs to be done and exactly how to do it, and it doesn't ask you to feel anything in particular while you're doing it. I rebuilt my parents' back bedroom into a room my dad actually wants to sit in now. That matters to me more than most of what I could say about the legal outcome. The record player is in there. He goes in some afternoons and puts on an album and just exists for a while. That room used to belong to someone who thought I wasn't paying attention. I was always paying attention.